All right, here we are again for another rousing economics lecture. And today, what we're going to talk about is fiscal policy. So, last week we talked a little bit about monetary policy, right? And that is the action of central banks. And I said that that was usually the way that the economy, the economy, that was the thing that affected the economy the most. Fiscal policy, though, is really, really important. So, with regard to like monetary policy, is going to impact the economy as a whole, but fiscal policy is a way of kind of directing economic activity in certain directions, right? So, for instance, if you have high levels of poverty, fiscal policy is one of the ways of addressing those high levels of poverty because it's through fiscal policy, through government spending, that money can be directed in certain areas. All right. So fiscal policy may not necessarily have a huge impact on the economy as a whole. It can, but it has to be pretty extreme. But it is a really great way to address certain economic corners of the society in ways that monetary policy just isn't set up to do, right? So fiscal policy. So what do I mean by fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is, by definition, policy regarding government spending. Right? This is the government raising money through taxes and then spending that money on the things, presumably in a democratic society, right? It's the things that the people within the country want the government to spend money on, right? We can debate whether or not that's valid, but that's the idea, right? Or, I mean, if it's a totalitarian government, then the government spends it on whatever the leader of the government wants to spend it on. The bottom line is, it's all fiscal policy. It doesn't matter. Government spending, fiscal policy. Now, of course, the very first question that we have to ask ourselves is, where does the government get the money? Well, the most obvious answer to this question is governments get their money through taxes. You pay for the government. Right, you guys pay for the government. So we had a whole little thing that happened, back some time ago called the American Revolution that had to do with taxes and should the government have the right to tax me if I don't have a say in what's going on in the government. And this debate on taxes continues, right? This debate on taxes continues on, with some folks suggesting that maybe people should pay a little bit more taxes in order to get access to more public goods, and then other people saying, well, why should I have to pay more taxes so that other people can get access to public goods that I don't necessarily want, right? What is the appropriate balance of taxes? We're all paying for taxes for things that we don't want, right? And we also, some of our taxes goes to stuff that we do want, and optimally in a democratic society, there's a constant debate, right, as to how to do this. Obviously, for me, I would love it if more taxes went to supporting education and supporting schools and to higher education, college and things like that. I would love it to see more money being spent on healthcare and things like that. Other people say, no, well, we need a strong national defense. We need money going mostly into the military. And there's whole political philosophies around this idea. With some folks saying it's not the government's job to spend money on this thing, but it is the government's job to spend the money on that thing. So, and the debate continues, and it's always going to continue, and it should continue. It is a healthy debate. So taxes, right? We pay taxes, and of course, everybody moans and groans about paying taxes, right? But it's through the taxes that we get the stuff that we want. If we didn't pay taxes, how else would we get the things like roads and bridges and sewer systems and, regulating our food supply, public schools, things that most people really kind of like? That stuff is paid for through taxes, right? So, another way for the government to get the money, now, normally under normal circumstances, the government doesn't make enough in taxes to cover all of the expenses. Think about what that would entail. I mean, think about, for instance, right now, where the economy is kind of taking hit. There's less taxes coming in, right? There's less money being made, because fewer people have jobs and fewer people have income, and much of our taxes comes from income tax. So there's less of that happening, And yet the demand for services, unemployment insurance, Medicaid, things like that is increasing. So what happens? And this is not uncommon, right? It's things happen. I mean, think about a country the size of the United States and what it takes to fund all of the things that 320 million people spread over millions of square miles requires in order to just to live and to have a decent life, right? If a hurricane hits someplace and you need to use federal money to help the people in that area, it's impossible to budget for a potential hurricane, right? So it's very difficult for you to really truly balance a federal government or even a budget like Florida's. Like Florida's about the size of the Netherlands when you really think about it in terms of population and the size of the economy. It's a big, political entity to plan a budget for. So some of the spending comes from debt. Some of the ways that the government gets the money to fund the things that it wants is through debt. And what does federal debt mean? Well, that's a really, really good question. We often kind of hear about the government going into debt to fund certain things, right? And as you can kind of see, I've got a chart showing the federal government that's associated with an assignment that you have, and a big chunk of that, I think, in this one, it's 15%. Of the budget is deficit spending. In other words, it's money that was borrowed. Right. Well, how does the government do it? The government just doesn't go to China and say, hey, can we borrow some money? That's not how that works, right? So how does the government get money to borrow, right? And the federal government, the U.S. government, uses U.S. Treasury bonds. Treasury bonds is the U.S. government's debt instrument. So what happens is the government issues Treasury bonds. You can get them. You can go on the Treasury Department of Treasury website and you can buy a Treasury bond. And we'll talk a little bit about bonds maybe a little bit later on. But you can get these Treasury bonds and then what ends up happening is you purchase these Treasury bonds. Let's say you spend $2,000 on a Treasury bond. Then what ends up happening is the government then pays you on that Treasury bond. The government then pays the interest on that Treasury bond. So you might get like a 30-year bond, and the government is now going to pay you on that bond for 30 years. It's going to pay you a yield. It's going to pay you a percentage based on the rates of the bond, and you're going to get that in a check from the government for X number of years. So you spent a couple $1,000s on a Treasury bond, and now you're going to get, it's not going to be an awful lot. The rates on Treasury bonds are not particularly high, which means the United States is able to borrow really, really cheap. But this is how it does it. Now, when it really needs to borrow, now, like for instance, we talk about the debt that we owe to China. Well, yeah, the government of China will come and buy U.S. Treasury bonds. And the government of China has bought lots and lots of Treasury bonds. It's not as high and as much as you think. I think it's kind of like 8% or something like that. It's not a particularly high number. We don't owe our entire functioning government to China, as some people make out. And the European Union will buy Treasury bonds. Germany could buy U.S. Treasury bonds. Amazon.com can buy U.S. Treasury bonds. Anybody can buy U.S. Treasury bonds, and they do. They're really, really phenomenally safe investments. But that's how the United States goes into debt. So now, when we take a look at, you can buy Treasury bonds. Anybody can buy Treasury bonds. Pension plans tend to buy up a lot of Treasury bonds. And when the government needs a lot of debt infusion right now, they go to the Federal Reserve. And they say, hey, Federal Reserve. Of course, the Federal Reserve is the U.S. government's central bank. We need to borrow. So that happens by the Federal Reserve just buying up tons and tons of Treasury bonds. And the U.S. government then has the money that it can make. And this, by the way, is why we're never going to have a balanced budget amendment. There's a debate in politics now. Usually when there's a Democrat as a president, Republicans bring up the idea of balanced budget amendments and stuff like that. It's part of the Republican, sometimes part of the Republican platform. Not so much the Democratic platform, but the bottom line is that we're never going to have a balanced budget amendment because it's virtually impossible to really balance the U.S. federal budget. And if you did that, that meant that you'd be limiting um, and actually kind of throwing up in the air the validity of the Treasury bond market. And that is a really, really important segment of the economy, is based on it and kind of balanced out using Treasury bonds. And if there's any doubts about whether or not the U.S. government is going to pay up on these Treasury bonds, that's a real problem. And also, debt has value, right? People want to hold these Treasury bonds there, and in order to have Treasury access to Treasury bonds, the U.S. government's got to be in debt. During times of surplus, there's no reason for the government to issue Treasury bonds. So this bond market is a really important part of the corner of the economy, and it is driven by U.S. government debt. So now take a look at the federal budget that I gave you the assignment on. There's a little budget on the assignment, a federal budget assignment, and you're going to take a look. If you take a look at that chart, I'll flash it here real quick. Take a look at this chart. What exactly is the federal budget? What does the government actually spend money on? I guess that's the next question, right? And my favorite is the economist Paul Krugman describes the U.S. federal budget as basically, if you take a look at the U.S. government from a budget perspective, the U.S. government is basically an insurance company with an army, right? So if you really take a look at what we're spending money on, most of it is some kind of social insurance spending. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, healthcare, things like that. And then, of course, one of the biggest is the U.S. military, where military spending is really, really huge. So basically, and then the rest is little things that we spend money on. So basically, what we're looking at is an insurance policy with an insurance company with an army. Right? Well, this then leads us to some questions as to how do we make these decisions about what to spend money on? Because a lot of the stuff here that you see, like take Social Security for example, right? The Social Security Act was passed in the 1930s, and it's been updated since then. But there are requirements, right? If you meet the requirements to get a Social Security check, you're 65 or older, or in my case, when I hit, I think it's 67 and a half or something like that, I qualify for Social Security. And my check is based on my annual income, my average annual income over my lifetime. If I qualify for a check for X number of dollars, the government, by law, has to provide me with that check. I qualify. They got to send me the check. It's the law. It's written right in there, right? They don't have a choice. If you have X number of retired people who qualify for X number of dollars, you got to provide that money. So it's not up to Congress at that point. It's just, what does the budget say? And they have to provide that money. They have to fund that. Right now, Social Security is a little different. Social Security has its own fund. Technically, the Social Security fund is separate from the overall budget. But there's other things. Medicare. If you're 65 and older, you qualify for Medicare. Bam! It doesn't matter. Congress can't make a decision as to how much money to put into Medicare. The law says that Medicare has to provide certain benefits for people in a certain age group. If you have that number of people in that age group, you don't have a choice, right? Unemployment insurance, Medicaid, things like this. These are what we call non-discretionary. It's mandatory spending. Another big one is the interest that we owe on our debt. We don't have to pay up the debt, but we do have to pay the interest on that debt. That's not any. When you get a Treasury bond, the government is agreeing to pay you a percent on that Treasury bond, and that percent is based on the rates that are going for that Treasury bond. The Congress doesn't have a choice. They can't say, well, we're not going to pay our Treasury bonds. Well, then the bond market collapses, right? They don't have a choice. This is non-discretionary. It's mandatory spending. They have to spend that. There's nothing else. They can't decide not to. Now, they can go in, they can then change the laws and say, okay, well, from now on, we're going to change the law for Medicare so that you have to be 70 and older instead of 65 and older. Right? They can do that. They'd have to change the law. But even at that, once you do that, then there's a certain amount of money that you're going to be putting out for people 70 and older, right? And you're going to tick off a lot of people between the ages of 60 and 70 who are then not going to vote for you, and you're going to lose your election. So you're not going to do that. So, but the bottom line is that is non-discretionary. It is mandatory. Congress doesn't have a choice. They've already passed that law. So that means that every year the argument about the budget has to do with discretionary spending, right? This is the spending that Congress makes yearly decisions about. And that has to do with military spending, how much money to spend on education, how much money to spend on, say, healthcare, how much money we're going to give to other countries, which, by the way, is not a lot of money. A lot of people say we can resolve our debt problems by just stop paying other countries, right? No, it's a really, really tiny amount of money that we spend on international, for other countries, and eliminating all of that, destabilizes the entire world, which means we'd end up having to spend a lot more money on, say, defense and the military, and we're not really saving all that much from our federal deficit, but that's a whole different story. How much money are we going to put into building roads and railways and broadband and stuff like that? These are the things that Congress has to debate. This is the discretionary spending. So then, how do we make decisions with regard to how we spend discretionary spending? And there's two ways there are two schools of thought on fiscal policy. Voila! All right. So these are the two schools of fiscal policy. There's two schools with regard to fiscal policy. One of them is called demand side. The other is called supply side. And these are especially important during times of, when things aren't going well, economically speaking. These are ways of kind of addressing economic shortfalls and what's the best way for the government to deal with the economy. So your demand-siders, these are your Keynesian. These are the folks who, the demand-siders, they are the ones that base their ideas with regard to fiscal policy on the theories of John Maynard Keynes and his general theory. And the idea behind demand side is that when things are going badly, when we're in an economic crisis, the best thing that the government can do is borrow money and spend it, right? Spend that money, especially spending that money on things like unemployment insurance and jobs programs and healthcare and things like that, right? Getting money into the hands of people who are going to spend that money, right? And even demand-siders don't have a problem with, for instance, cutting taxes during times of economic crisis, because that puts more money in the pockets of regular people. Now, the taxes, of course, they would want to cut is the taxes like income taxes and stuff like that mostly affect working people. So the idea is to cut that, even if the government has to borrow. The idea behind this is that when the government's borrowing money, remember, it's borrowing money by issuing Treasury Bonds, right? Usually Treasury Bonds to banks like the Federal Reserve, and borrowing that money and putting that money into circulation. What does that do? Well, by putting money into circulation, you are increasing the monetary base, and if you direct that money to the hands of people who are going to spend it, then that is money that people are going to then spend that money, and that's going to increase aggregate demand. So the idea behind demand-side economics is that the role of the government during times of economic hardship is to prime the pump. Just borrow and get money into the economy. Now, the good part of this is, usually during times of economic crisis, the interest owed on bonds is usually really, really low. Right now, the interest that we owe on Treasury bonds is really, really, in fact, long-term bonds, if you factor in the value of the dollar, are even negative, right? It makes sense for the government to borrow at times when rates are really, really low and get that money out there, because then they don't owe as much back. It's not as hard to, you never really pay off the debt. Governments that are in debt generally don't pay off that debt. What they do is they pay on the interest, they pay on the yield, right? So, but the bottom line is that that's the Keynesian idea. Now, when things are going well, the Keynesians think, hey, that's time to raise taxes, that's time to build up your budget surpluses and stuff like that, and get a little nest egg put aside for crisis and things like that when things are going well. And the demand siders also feel that it's kind of important to target fiscal policy at maybe working class and middle class people, right? Getting money. What are some ways, for instance, one of the things that the demand siders will say is, hey, look, poverty is costly. So why don't we direct some money to dealing with poverty, right? We can do that through things like Medicaid. We can do that through things like food stamps. We can do that through things like small business loans in poor communities, things along those lines. Those are all demand side. So what those do, that idea behind demand side then, is to actually kind of redistribute the wealth, right? The folks who are your top earners are the ones paying the most taxes, and then you direct that down to the people who are in the lower segments, right? And you help them. If they're getting money, then what are they spending that money on? They're spending that money on things like rent. They're spending that money on things like food. They're spending that money on things like maybe job training and stuff like that. But the bottom line is they're spending the money. It doesn't really matter what they're spending it on. They're spending the money, and that money then becomes part of the aggregate demand. And that's a stimulatory effect, right? The bottom line is that's the demand side. So the demand side, is the idea is to stimulate demand, stimulate the economy by stimulating demand, putting money in the hands of the people who will spend it. Demand siders don't like the idea of like tax cuts for wealthy people. And the reason why they don't necessarily like that idea, it's not necessarily, they're not entirely against it, but the idea is that, well, rich people don't have to spend the money, right? Wealthy people can take the money that they make from, say, tax cuts or things like that, and instead of spending it, they can just sit on it. They can even spend it in other countries, right? Instead of the United States, which doesn't help the American economy. So demand side is not too partial to that. The bottom line with regard to demand side economics is the goal of demand side fiscal policy is to stimulate demand, to get money in the hands of people who are going to spend it. By increasing aggregate demand, you increase the monetary base. You increase the monetary base, your economy grows. Pretty simple stuff, right? Now that is contradicted by the supply siders. And now the demand side school is associated with John Maynard Keynes. The supply side is, it harkens back to a fellow by the name of Milton Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics. And Milton Friedman said, yeah, but wait a minute. It's really not, the demand side isn't really going to work all that well, because if you're raising taxes, for instance, raising taxes on businesses or raising taxes on the wealthy, that means that they're not going to spend that money on their businesses, right? So they're not going to be hiring as many people. They're not going to be expanding their physical plant. They're going to be looking for other ways of making money that isn't necessarily going to help your economy. Maybe they're going to invest more in Germany or find places where the taxes are lower and the regulations are lower, and they're going to move their businesses there, and that's not going to help the United States. So the idea behind supply-side economics is, and also the Friedmanites also point out that, well, as your debt increases, ultimately the interest on that debt is going to increase. You're going to have to pay for that debt at some point, which the demand siders say actually isn't really true necessarily, not in the way we think about it. But the Milton Friedman side say you're going to have to pay. Somebody's going to have to pay that, and what that means is if people think that their future taxes are going to increase, then what they're going to do is they're going to save their money, and they're not going to put it in the economic base. So it's not going to work. So the supply siders say no. The best way for governments to stimulate the economy is through supply side, through stimulating the willingness of businesses to supply a good or service, right? So the idea behind the supply siders is to stimulate investment. Well, how can the government stimulate investment? Well, the government can stimulate investment by cutting taxes on the job creators, the businesses, right, and the people who own the businesses, cut their taxes, and that means that there's going to be more money for them to spend on their businesses, which means hiring more people. And the supply siders also say government regulation is costly, and government regulation disincentivizes businesses from investing in their businesses, right? If I have to spend more money to, say, deal with toxic waste, right? well, then I'm not, you know what, it's too costly, I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to invest, right? And it, any kind of regulation, things like a minimum wage. A minimum wage is costly to me. As an employer, why not just put the wages up on the market and let me get my labor according to market standards based on supply and demand, rather than having to pay a minimum wage that costs me money, right? That I could be saving by paying a little bit less to my employees. So the idea behind this is you stimulate investment by cutting taxes and deregulating the market. And this is the idea behind the supply side school of economics. And the supply siders, they got a really good kick in the 1970s when the country was experiencing that stagflation that I talked about in the previous video. A lot of people were looking at the demand side and saying, this is not a problem that demand side is going to be able to fix. And also during that time, there were growing numbers of regulations. There was expanding welfare state because of the Great Society. There was greater pressure to regulate environmental pollution and things like that. And the supply siders were saying, hey, look, all of these policies that you're putting into place to provide a welfare state and to provide for regulating the environment, all of that money is a cost to businesses, and then businesses are not going to be willing to invest. The 1970s also started to see a period of deindustrialization. That's where this idea of deindustrialization started in the United States, where manufacturing jobs, companies were moving their manufacturing bases to, Mexico in the 1970s, but later on, manufacturing is going to be moving to Asia and China specifically, right? And the United States was losing its competitive edge with a lot of countries that were coming online, like Germany and Japan that had been destroyed during World War II. In the late 60s, they started to come online and started to produce goods, especially like cars and things like that. And they were starting to compete with American companies, which of course increases the cost of these American companies. So how do we deal with that, right? How do we deal with that? So that is supply side. And demand side. And by the way, there's another issue that is that kind of comes up now, which is kind of weird, but it's because it's been a long time since this has really been an issue. But tariffs. How do I spell? Okay, Google, how do you spell tariff?
Tariff is spelled Tariff.
Tariffs. Now, of course, as you know, tariffs are a tax on goods and services that are imported from other countries, or it's a tax on goods and services that are exported, right? Basically, goods that cross borders are subject to tariffs. So that's what that is. And tariffs has become kind of a debate because our current administration feels that an old school idea called protectionism, the idea if you raise tariffs, that increases the costs on foreign goods, and that incentivizes businesses to start their companies in the United States. For the most part, both demand-siders and supply-siders are not particular fans of tariffs. Demand-siders don't like tariffs because the tariffs increase the costs. When a company has to pay a tariff, it doesn't pay the tariff. The company passes the cost of that tariff onto the consumers. You pay higher prices for the goods and services. So what they may do is, just because if you put a tariff on Chinese goods, well, these businesses, all right, well, we'll move to Vietnam. There's no tariff on Vietnamese goods. It's a very difficult process. The supply-siders are usually not fans of tariffs because it de-incentivizes investment, right? So neither of these sides are particularly fond of the idea of tariffs. There are segments of the economic spectrum that like the idea of protective tariffs. I think most economists on both the demand and supply side look at our current tariff situation and suggest that really the gains that we've made by raising tariffs have been washed out by losses that we made in other segments of the economy. So, for instance, if you put a tariff on steel, that increases the cost of the steel. Even if companies come to the United States and say, all right, well, we're going to produce more steel in the United States, the reason why they weren't producing the steel in the United States to begin with was because the costs were higher. they have to pay more and that kind of thing. So either way, the cost of that is going to be passed on. Well, think about it now. If you increase the cost of steel, then that increases the cost of everything made with steel, like automobiles. And then what that does is, yes, maybe steel producers can make more money, but then on the other end of the spectrum, car manufacturers are now making less money, because if you raise the price of the automobiles, then what happens? The demand goes down. So maybe we've made some gains in, say, profits in steel, but we've lost that amount of money with regard to decreasing auto sales and that kind of stuff. So neither side of these are particularly big fans of tariffs. Anyway, but these are the two schools of thought for fiscal policy. Hopefully, this video didn't last very long, as long as you want, and we can move on. So I'll talk to you later. Just kidding. One last thing. I did notice, and I debated whether or not to talk about it this time, but what the heck. But I have gotten a lot of questions as to why. Why is monetary policy so much more influential over the economy than, say, fiscal policy? And I don't necessarily want to infer that fiscal policy is unimportant, but I do want to talk about, in an earlier video that wasn't really required, I talked about the monetary base and aggregate demand. So check that out. It wasn't a required video, but it does have some valuable information. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that right now. Aggregate demand and the monetary base. The monetary base is basically all of the money in the market. All right. So if you think in terms of all of the dollars that are out there, right, that is your monetary base. And aggregate demand is basically that money being used. All right. People spending money that's the aggregate demand, and that's a key component of the Keynesians. I tend to lean toward the demand side Keynesian explanation for the economy. So exactly what are the consequences of this? What exactly does this mean? Well, we can take a look at something called the aggregate output expenditure model, and this is it right here. It's basically a formula. All right. And in essence, your economy is basically your spending from your consumers, spending from your investors, spending from government, plus trade. Okay? And the trade part can get a little bit confusing, and there's a whole separate kind of economics part of that has to do with trade and international trade. If you want to think more in terms of it, take a look at Krugman and some of the work that he did. At the bottom but for the purposes of this model, trade has to do with our exports minus our imports. Obviously, if we're exporting, right, then that means that people are getting dollars to purchase American products, and we're exporting our stuff, and they're sending money into the country, and that increases our monetary base. Imports is stuff we're taking money and we're sending it away from our market, and we're purchasing goods and services. So we can look at trade in terms of exports minus imports, right? And right now we have what's called a trade deficit. So a trade deficit means that this number then is negative. This is a minus sign, in other words, for us right now. Now, there's debate as to whether or not that matters all that much, right? One of the things that we can say is, well, yeah, maybe this is a minus sign, but it's actually a plus sign for consumers, because they're not paying as much. They can actually buy more goods and services because the goods and services are cheaper, and that means that's basically a wash. And okay, that sounds okay. But the bottom line is if your market is based on these consumers, investors, and government, then what ends up happening? Well, if the government is going to spend more money and expand the economic base, what does that mean? Well, that means that they got to get that money from somewhere. And where are they getting that money from? Well, it may very well be that they are getting that money from taxes, right? So yes, the government then can spend more, but in the process of spending more, it's getting more money from consumers and investors, so it doesn't necessarily do anything to expand the monetary base, unless it borrows the money. If it borrows the money, then it's not raising taxes on consumers and investors, and it can put that money. But then we're talking about monetary policy, right? Because the government's going to borrow from the central banks. So that's part of the reason why. Now, if the government, let's say the government says cuts taxes. Okay, well, the government says cuts taxes. Let's say we do what the supply siders say, simply because it's easier on the graph, and we cut taxes on businesses. We cut taxes on the investors. Well, that means that there's more money for the investors, but there's less money for the government. So it's a wash. Economically speaking, it's a wash, right? And that's another thing that's another reason why you're never going to have a balanced budget amendment. Because if you have a balanced budget amendment, nothing the government can do is going to be able to influence the government, because the economy, because then the government can't borrow, and the government can only influence the economy through borrowing, basically. Now, one of the arguments that we can make is that, okay, if the government borrows money right now, eventually they've got to pay that money back, and that's going to be money that's not available to spend in other areas, and that's a legitimate argument. So how do you maintain that balance becomes the argument. But anyway, this the aggregate demand model. Aggregate output and expenditure model is pretty useful in understanding this idea of the monetary base and aggregate demand. Is a pretty valuable feature of economics. So hopefully that explained it a little bit better.